I never thought I'd wake up to a lynx curled at my feet, but here we are. His fur, thick and silver gray, rises and falls with each slow breath, his tufted ears twitching in some half-dream. If I move too much, he lets out a soft grumble, half complaint, half comfort. It still doesn't feel real. A wild animal, once fragile and lost, now trusts me enough to sleep beside me like this. But if you had seen him the way I first did, shivering, half buried in the snow, barely more than a shadow of life, you'd understand why I couldn't walk away. I found him deep in the forest, curled in on himself near a frozen creek. His fur was soaked through, his tiny paws raw from the ice. No mother in sight. No tracks leading away. Just him, alone, fading into the cold. I didn't think he'd survive the night. But something in his wide, wild eyes told me I had to try. And now, months later, I realized saving him wasn't just about keeping him alive. It was about what came next, something I never could have imagined. I still remember the moment I found him. The storm had passed, leaving the forest buried under a thick layer of snow. The air was sharp, biting at my skin, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. I wasn't looking for anything, or rather, I wasn't expecting to find anything. But then I saw it. A shape, half buried in the snow near the edge of a frozen creek. Small. Still. At first, I thought it was just a clump of fur left behind by some animal, but then I saw the faint rise and fall of its chest. My heart pounded. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed the tracks. Lynx tracks. And something else, deep grooves in the snow, signs of a struggle. Blood spattered across the ice. I crouched down, brushing the snow away with shaky hands. Beneath it, a lynx cub, barely more than a few weeks old, curled up in a desperate attempt to stay warm. His fur was matted with ice, his paws raw and cracked. When I touched him, he barely reacted. Just a weak, shallow breath. His mother was gone. I scanned the trees, hoping, praying, that she was near, that she'd come back. But the forest was silent. Nothing but the whisper of wind through the branches. Whatever had happened here was over. And he was alone. I didn't have time to think. If I left him, he wouldn't last another hour. Carefully, I scooped him up, cradling his fragile body against my chest. He was so cold, his body limp, his ears twitching weakly. For a moment, I thought I was too late. But then, as I wrapped him in my coat, I felt it, the tiniest movement. A shiver, a small sign of life. That was all I needed. I turned and started running, the snow crunching beneath my boots, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The wind howled around me, and with each step, I could feel his weight in my arms, lighter than he should be, weaker than he should be. He was fighting. I just had to fight for him too. I set up a warm corner for him near the fireplace, layering blankets and an old dog bed to keep him comfortable. He was still so small, his fur thin from hunger, his breath slow and uneven. I fed him warm milk through a syringe, hoping it was enough, hoping I hadn't found him too late. But then, on the third morning, I saw it. A twitch of his ear. A slow, groggy blink. Then, with surprising effort, he lifted his head and let out the softest, weakest little growl I'd ever heard. It wasn't much. But it was something. And from that moment on, he fought. By the end of the week, he was moving around the house, clumsy, cautious, but undeniably curious. He'd take a few wobbly steps, his paws still awkward on the wooden floor, then stop to sniff at everything in sight. Every noise made him jump, every shadow sent him crouching low, his wild instincts still on high alert. But soon, he was exploring. Testing. Learning. And then he met Bruno. Bruno, my old shepherd mix, had been watching him from a distance since day one. Patient. Unbothered. But the first time the lynx cub, still nameless, still fragile, wobbled too close, Bruno let out a low, warning woof. The cub froze. For a long second, they just stared at each other. Bruno, massive and sturdy, standing his ground. The cub, barely the size of Bruno's head, his tiny ears twitching. Then, after a few tense heartbeats, the cub flopped onto his belly. Not in fear. Not in submission. But in pure exhaustion. Bruno let out a huff, almost like a sigh. Then, to my utter disbelief, he laid down beside him. It was the beginning of something I never expected. Over the next few days, the cub started following Bruno everywhere. He'd trail after him in the yard, wide-eyed and eager, watching his every move. When Bruno dug into the snow to find an old buried toy, the cub tried to do the same, only to end up face-first in the cold, a confused chirp escaping him. When Bruno stretched lazily on the porch, the cub would copy him, mimicking every movement with eerie precision. It was like he was trying to figure out what he was supposed to be. Then came the first pounce. One afternoon, as I watched from the kitchen, Bruno was lazily wagging his tail near the couch. The cub had been watching him for minutes, ears perked, muscles tense. Then, suddenly, he leapt. His tiny paws smacked against Bruno's back. For a split second, there was silence. Then, Bruno turned, let out a deep-chested woof, and the chase was on. The cub squeaked in surprise and darted under the table, skidding wildly on the floor. Bruno followed, slow but playful, his tail wagging the whole time. And for the first time since I found him, I heard it. A real, full-bodied lynx chirp. Excited. Joyful. Alive. And in that moment, I knew. He was going to be okay. Raising a lynx wasn't easy. Even as he grew stronger, I could tell he was never meant to be a pet. Some days, he would curl up beside me, his thick fur warming my side as I read by the fire. Other days, he would vanish, slipping into the shadows of the house, moving so silently I wouldn't notice he was watching me until I caught the gleam of his golden eyes from the corner of the room. He was still wild. And the wild was calling him back. Then, one night, he was gone. I had stepped outside for just a moment, and when I turned back, the door stood open. The wind howled through the empty frame. Snow drifted in. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a flashlight and ran into the forest, my boots sinking deep into the snow. My breath was sharp in my lungs, my heart hammering. He was still small. Still vulnerable. And out there, in the dark, were predators that wouldn't hesitate to strike. Then, I saw them. Just beyond the tree line, two shapes stood in the moonlight. The cub. And another lynx. Bigger. Stronger. His mother. She was frozen, her wild eyes locked onto mine, muscles tensed, ready to fight or flee. My lynx, stood between us, ears twitching. Was this why he left? The wind shifted. The mother let out a low, rumbling sound, a call, deep and ancient. And the cub took a step toward her. I held my breath. This was it. This was the moment. Would he stay? Or would he go? For a long, breathless moment, I stood frozen, watching. The cub turned back to look at me. His golden eyes met mine, uncertain, searching. I could see the hesitation in his tiny frame, the pull between two worlds. Then, slowly, he stepped toward her. My throat tightened. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To see him return to where he belonged. To be free. To have a second chance at the life that had almost been stolen from him. The mother lynx let out another soft call, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He pressed against her side, rubbing his head beneath her chin, just like he used to do with Bruno. And then, just like that, they were gone. Back into the wild. The house felt quieter after that. Emptier. For weeks, I kept looking for him. Listening. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow that moved beyond the porch made my heart leap. But he didn't return. And in time, I accepted it. He wasn't mine to keep. I had been a bridge, a stepping stone, a moment in his story, not the whole thing. But then, 1 year later, He came back. I had just stepped outside to collect firewood when I felt it, the weight of something watching me. I turned, and there he was. Bigger. Stronger. A full-grown lynx now, his fur thick and silver in the winter light. And he wasn't alone. 2 small cubs peeked out from behind him, their tufted ears twitching, wide-eyed and cautious. I barely breathed. He had brought them here. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The wild lynx and the man who had saved him. Then, slowly, he dipped his head, just once. A silent acknowledgement. A trust that had never faded. And just like that, he was gone again. But this time, I didn't feel loss. This time, I felt honored. Because in the end, he had never forgotten.